In the spring of 1954, a state archivist named Clarence Whitfield descended a staircase beneath the Vermont State House in Montpelier that maintenance workers had uncovered while replacing a water main 3 days earlier. He carried a flashlight, a yellow legal pad, and a permission slip signed by the building superintendent, a document that the superintendent would later claim he had no memory of signing. The staircase ended at a corridor. The corridor ended at a door. The door was iron, framed in dressed granite, and fitted with a lock of a type that Whitfield later described to his supervisor as Federal issue, pre-1900. The same pattern as the locks on the old Treasury Annex rooms in Washington. He could not open it. But he could see, by pressing his flashlight to the gap at the floor, that the space beyond was not empty. There was a wooden floor. There were the legs of shelving units. And there was, faintly, the smell of paper. Not rotting paper, but paper that had been stored correctly, in dry air, for a very long time. By the time Whitfield returned to street level, the building superintendent had been telephoned by someone he described only as a man from the federal office. By the time Whitfield arrived at work the following morning, the staircase had been filled with gravel and the water main work had been completed ahead of schedule. Clarence Whitfield filed a 3-page incident report. It was never entered into the State Archives registry. His supervisor told him, in a note that Whitfield kept for the rest of his life, that the incident was a matter outside the scope of our department. The official explanation for what Whitfield found, to the extent that one was ever offered, was that the space beneath the Vermont State House was a disused utility corridor, sealed in the ordinary course of building maintenance. That explanation does not account for a federal pattern lock on a door in a state building. It does not account for a telephone call from a federal office within hours of a state archivist's unauthorized entry. And it does not account for the fact that Whitfield's incident report, which he retained a personal copy of, describes something he noticed before he reached the iron door: a series of recessed niches in the corridor wall, each approximately 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, each fitted with a small iron bracket, identical in spacing and construction to the document storage niches described in the original 1793 design specifications for the United States Capitol Building in Washington, D.C. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to bury this kind of research, unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Clarence Whitfield found beneath the Vermont State House in 1954, and why a federal office responded to it within the same business day, you have to go back not just a few years. You have to go back to 1855, and to a man named Montgomery C. Meigs, a United States Army captain who had been assigned by the War Department to oversee the construction and expansion of the United States Capitol. Meigs was not simply a builder. He was a systems engineer of exceptional precision. A man who had designed the Washington Aqueduct, supervised the construction of the Capitol's cast-iron dome, and whose professional correspondence, now held at the Library of Congress in a collection spanning 41 archival boxes, reveals a mind preoccupied with problems that went far beyond walls and roof lines. The standard biographies of Meigs present him as a gifted military engineer and later a capable quartermaster general during the Civil War. What they do not present, because the relevant correspondence has never been centrally discussed in any published history, is his preoccupation, beginning in the mid-1850s, with what he called in several letters the problem of institutional permanence, by which he meant, specifically, the permanence of documents. In an 1857 letter to the Secretary of War, Meigs wrote that the Capitol's subgrade spaces had been designed not only for utility purposes, but for what he called the permanent safeguarding of the constitutional record. That phrase, the permanent safeguarding of the constitutional record, does not appear in any of the publicly cited histories of the Capitol's construction. It appears in one letter, in a 41-box collection that very few researchers have worked through in full. Meigs was 40 years old when he wrote it. He had another 35 years of professional life ahead of him. He never returned to the subject in writing, at least not in writing that has been made available to the public. What Meigs was describing, and what the standard history of American State House architecture almost entirely omits, is that the Capitol building in Washington was constructed with a sub-basement document storage system that was specifically designed to be both fireproof and access restricted. The 1793 design specifications, portions of which are held by the architect of the Capitol's office, describe a lower-level series of alcoves and corridors with iron-fitted niches intended for the long-term preservation of original legislative documents. This was not a library. It was not a reading room. It was a vault, built into the foundation of the building, with the explicit intention that its contents would outlast any administration, any Congress, and any catastrophe that might befall the building above it. The design was considered so important that in 1859, Meigs submitted a formal proposal to the Department of the Interior recommending that the same subgrade document storage system be incorporated into the construction of every new state capitol building receiving federal architectural guidance. His proposal was approved. It was approved in a departmental memo dated March 14, 1859, signed by the Secretary of the Interior. And then, in a pattern you will recognize by the end of this video, it was never referenced again in any subsequent public document about State House construction. Between 1859 and 1887, 17 state capitol buildings were either newly constructed or substantially renovated in the United States. 14 of them received direct federal architectural guidance during that period. The architectural firms involved in those 14 projects were all, in one form or another, connected to the network of designers who had worked under Meigs on the Capitol expansion. This was not unusual in the 19th century. Federal architectural influence over civic construction was considered an expression of national unity. What was unusual is what a researcher found when she began mapping the physical results of that influence. A Massachusetts Institute of Technology architectural historian named Dr. Elaine Forrow spent 3 years in the 1980s tracing the subgrade construction plans for 11 of those 14 statehouses for a monograph on 19th century American civic architecture. Her method was straightforward and scrupulous. She obtained the original architectural drawings from state archives, compared them against the public building permits filed with state authorities at the time of construction, and noted any discrepancies. What she found, and what she described in a 1988 paper submitted to the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, was that 10 of the 11 buildings she examined had sub-basement levels that did not appear on the public building records filed with the relevant state authorities. 10 out of 11. Not one building. Not two. A structural feature that was present in nearly every statehouse she examined, and that was systematically absent from every public record. The paper was accepted for review. It was never published. Dr. Forrow told a colleague, in a letter written in 1989, that the colleague later shared with a regional architectural preservation group, that she had been contacted by an attorney representing a federal preservation office who had raised concerns about the sourcing of her architectural records. She withdrew the paper. She never returned to the subject in print. Her monograph on 19th century civic architecture was published in 1992. It contains no reference to sub-basement discrepancies. It contains no reference to the paper she withdrew. It reads, in its treatment of State House construction, as though the 3 years she spent on the subject had never happened. Before we go further, if this is the kind of investigation that matters to you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We pull these threads every week. The official record would prefer you didn't watch. There is a pattern in that history, and it runs deeper than one academic paper that disappeared before it could be read. In 1887, the year from which we date the current locks on these spaces. Something happened at the federal level that has never been fully explained. Congress passed an appropriations bill that included a line item, buried in the fourth appendix of a 312-page budget document, allocating funds to the preservation and security of subgrade federal document storage in state capitol buildings. The sum allocated was $214,000. In 1887 dollars, that was an enormous commitment, equivalent in purchasing power to several $million today. The official record says only that the funds were administered by the Treasury Department's Office of the Supervising Architect. What the official record does not say is what was in those spaces that required federal money to secure, or why the federal government was involved in the subgrade security of state buildings at all. The answer, or the closest thing to an answer that the documentary record permits, comes from a source that surfaces only once and then vanishes. In 1891, a former Treasury Department clerk named Horace Dent, who had worked in the Office of the Supervising Architect from 1882 to 1889, wrote a private letter to his brother in Cincinnati. Dent was not a significant figure by any measure. He was a clerk. He copied documents, maintained ledgers, and organized filing systems. He was not an architect, not an official, not a man whose opinions would have been solicited on matters of policy. But he was, for 7 years, in the room where papers moved. He saw what came in, what went out, and what was filed in the restricted cabinet that sat behind the supervising architect's personal office. The one, he noted in his letter, that none of the clerks were ever instructed to index. The letter was donated to the Cincinnati Public Library in 1943 by Dent's granddaughter as part of a family papers collection. It sat uncatalogued for 11 years before a library volunteer named Ruth Pelham indexed it in 1954. The same year Clarence Whitfield found his iron door in Vermont. In that letter, Horace Dent wrote that the work carried out in 1887 under the Treasury Department's appropriation was not simply a matter of installing new locks. He wrote that the original document chambers beneath 14 state capitol buildings had been inventoried, resealed, and placed under federal custodianship. He wrote that the inventory had been conducted by a team of 4 men he identified only by initials. And he wrote, in a sentence he underlined twice, that the materials he had seen listed on the inventory were not the records of the individual states. They were, he said, the foundational correspondence of the compact itself. Cincinnati, 1891, Vermont, 1954. That is 63 years between 2 independent references to the same space, and neither man had any knowledge of the other. The Carnegie Corporation has never explained its subgrade properties. The Treasury Department has never explained the 1887 appropriation. No state historical society has ever acknowledged the existence of sub-basement levels in their capitol buildings that do not appear on public architectural records. The Carnegie Corporation, the Treasury Department, and every state historical office connected to these buildings has never adequately addressed several specific questions. None of them has ever explained why 14 state capitol buildings constructed under federal architectural guidance have sub-basement levels absent from public records. None of them has ever explained why a federal office telephoned a Vermont building superintendent within hours of a state archivist's discovery in 1954. None of them has ever explained what the $214,000 appropriated by Congress in 1887 for subgrade security in state capitol buildings was actually securing. Why would the federal government spend the equivalent of several $1 million in today's money to install new locks on rooms in state buildings unless those rooms contained something the federal government considered its own? Why would an academic paper documenting sub-basement discrepancies in 11 state houses be withdrawn after contact from a federal preservation attorney? Why does the 1887 appropriation appear only in the fourth appendix of a 312-page budget document? The one place in a congressional bill where an item can be passed without floor debate or public record of the vote. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But here is what makes Clarence Whitfield's 1954 account different from every other account of sealed spaces beneath American state houses. Whitfield kept his personal copy of the incident report. When he retired in 1971, he took it home. When he died in 1983, his daughter found it in a fireproof box along with 2 other documents he had apparently collected over the years without explanation. The first was a photocopy of a page from an 1859 federal architectural specification, the page that describes the iron bracket document storage niches in the subgrade spaces of the Capitol building. The dimensions matched, to the inch, what Whitfield had described in the corridor beneath the Vermont State House. The second was a handwritten note on paper bearing a Treasury Department letterhead, undated, unsigned, containing a single line, "Storage current as of last inspection." Federal custodianship confirmed. Whitfield's daughter contacted the Vermont State Archives with these documents in 1984. A state archivist examined them and told her they were authentic. She was contacted by a federal attorney 9 days later. The documents were returned to her. They were not entered into any archive. They are, as far as anyone has been able to determine, still in her possession. There are 49 state capitol buildings in the continental United States, excluding the federal Capitol in Washington. 31 of them were constructed or substantially renovated between 1840 and 1900. If the pattern established by Meggs's 1859 proposal holds, if even half of those buildings received subgrade document chambers under federal architectural guidance, then there are, beneath the governmental buildings of this country, somewhere between 15 and 20 sealed spaces that do not appear on any public architectural record. Spaces that have been under federal custodianship since at least 1887. Spaces that were inventoried once by 4 men whose names appear only as initials in a private letter from a Treasury clerk. Spaces whose contents Horace Dent described, in a letter no one was supposed to find, as the foundational correspondence of the compact itself. What compact? Between whom? Signed when? These are the questions that Dent's letter raises and does not answer. These are the questions that Whitfield's incident report raises, and that his supervisor dismissed with a note about scope. These are the questions that Dr. Elaine Forrow spent 3 years trying to answer through architectural records before a federal attorney asked her to stop. The honest answer is that we do not know. What we have is an architect's private letter, a congressional appropriation buried in an appendix, an academic paper that vanished before publication, a state archivist's incident report that was never filed, a federal telephone call that arrived within hours of an unauthorized entry, and a fireproof box in a Vermont family's possession that contains documents whose dimensions match specifications written in Washington more than a century before they were found. Taken individually, each of these might be dismissed. Taken together, they describe a program, not an accident, not an oversight, not a series of unrelated coincidences. A program that was built into the foundations of this country's government and has been quietly maintained ever since. The iron door beneath the Vermont State House is still there. The gravel that was poured over the staircase in 1954 was a temporary fill. Building records show that the water main work in that section of the State House was revisited in 1967 and again in 1991, both times by contractors whose work orders listed no access to subgrade levels. The door, by every indication available, has not been opened since whatever federal team inventoried it in 1887. That is 138 years. The air behind that door, if the cedar and wax preservation methods documented in Meigs's 1857 correspondence were applied, is still dry. The documents it holds, whatever they are, have not decayed. The official history of American civic architecture tells us that these buildings were constructed as monuments to democratic governance, open to the people they serve. What the architectural specifications, the congressional appropriations, the terminated academic papers, and the fireproof box of a retired Vermont archivist tell us is that at least some of what was built beneath those monuments was never intended for the people at all. The pattern does not require you to believe in conspiracy. It requires only that you look at what was built, who paid for it, and who has kept the keys for 138 years. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you've made it this far, you already know that history kept beneath the floor is still history. Subscribe and share this with someone who still believes the record is complete. It is not. It has never been. Next week, I'm following a single name that appears in both the 1887 Treasury appropriation and in the private correspondence of a senator who died in 1889, 14 months after the locks were changed. He was found dead in his Washington office. The cause was listed as cardiac failure. He was 44 years old. He had no prior history of heart disease. His private papers were removed from his office the same afternoon his death was announced. You won't want to miss it.